Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early warning briefing for Thursday, the 19th of September, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. I just want to say thank you for joining us here every day. It's really great to see all the activity in the chat and people following along. And, we have a couple of really, really important items to cover today. Let me find Jared because we're going to start off with Taiwan. There's a couple of things going on. All right, Jared, good morning. We're going to start off here with this Navy Chief of Naval Operations, the CNO. And there's a plan that was published yesterday that looks to be explicitly not calling for, but explicitly preparing for a war with China in 2027. For the past couple of years, we've heard this 2027 date floating around kind of inside the Beltway defense establishment talks. We've seen these admirals and generals on panels and speaking to the media, all kind of honing in on 2027. I believe that is the last, I want to say that's the last year of Xi Jinping's third term. So a pretty significant year for Xi Jinping and for China as well. But let's focus on this report that was published yesterday. The CNO is explicitly calling for or preparing for war with China in 2027. What are the details?
Yes. So right off the bat, this only refers explicitly to the Pacific theater. It refers to the other theaters once, and that is in the past tense. So everything else forward tense is Pacific theater preparations. The CNO admits that the Navy will not achieve the desired end strength by 2027. So we have a goal of up over 380 ships. Not going to hit it. I was doing a count yesterday. We're going to be down around 340 ships after the decommissions go through this year, next year. And in order to supplement that, they intend to have pre-positioned forces, unmanned systems, a heavy reliance on allies, partners, which I thought was an interesting inclusion as separate from allies, and the joint force. The joint force is very significant because this is obviously a naval theater, and they're heavily dependent on the entire joint force, including the land forces. The CNO intends to have 80% of the surface fleet combat ready by 2027 by just eliminating maintenance delays. She actually did not expound on how she plans to do that. I was talking with Robert about that yesterday, is basically eliminate maintenance delays by just eliminating maintenance delays. And
so let's talk about that real quick, because one of the things you put over in our private chat, I think yesterday, was how many years, I guess cumulatively, how many years worth of maintenance delays the Navy is currently experiencing.
Yes, the United States Naval Institute published that it was 2,700 days, which is about 7.3 years worth of I'm assuming is cumulative maintenance. There's no way that we're behind 7 on average.
Yeah. So this is 7 years worth of maintenance, and just explain this process. So a Navy boat is out for so many days on a mission or so many months, and at some point you reach the end of the maintenance life cycle. You got to bring this boat in for maintenance. What type of stuff happens during those maintenance cycles?
So there are really 2 broad categories that you can have. You have the short maintenance periods where you can do it while you're technically kind of combat ready, doing very, very surface level things like deck preservation, fixing problems within systems. And then there's a layup period. And I think that's where the big hang up is for this. Mm-hmm. That's where you can be pulled out into a dry dock. They do all kinds of work on the hull. They can even do work on the mast, where start taking the mast apart on the ship that I was on. They were doing that when I arrived. They do complete overhauls of systems during all that, and it's frequent. It's very frequent for ships to get delayed during that period. I think we were delayed by 6 months at the time, and that was pretty noteworthy. That was a significant delay. At 2,700 cumulative delays or days, with about 30% of the Navy in maintenance at any given period. I think that works out to a few months of delay for every single ship on average.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So we're not going to get caught up in the next couple of years. Here's the bottom line. The CNO plan talks about embracing novel approaches to readiness. I mean, who even knows what that means? Jared, anything of concern to us?
I'm very concerned that this embracing novel approaches is just reworking the definition so you meet the wicket, meaning that people are not actually combat ready, but we're going to say they're combat ready.
Yeah, so like in the Army, I think combat effectiveness is like a 90% unit strength or something like that. And so if you just reduce the unit size and taking all the non-combat ready personnel off the books, then you can achieve that 90%, even though I imagine it's numbers games like that on an Excel spreadsheet, not actually improving readiness.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Additionally, the CNO maintained that the Navy needs to have a budget 3 to 5% increased over inflation every single year, which right now is running 5.5 to 7.5% every single year. But the fiscal 25 request is only a 0.7% increase. So not even 1% increase. And in order just to maintain what we have, they need 5% increase.
So not even keeping up with the pace of inflation. Okay.
No.
Yeah, this is all really, really concerning news here. Let's move on to Taiwan, because in the past week or so, there's been a handful of very interesting articles about the defense of Taiwan. Let's start off with the defense minister over there, Welling Koo. He said that, well, he said a number of things, one of which it's becoming far more difficult to tell when China is actually preparing for war versus just preparing for an exercise.
Yes. Specifically, he was saying that the scale of Chinese activity is getting larger and larger, so it's harder to discern when they might be shifting from training to a large exercise and from exercise to war. In addition to that, he did say that Taiwan has been quietly expanding military cooperation with the U.S. and other friends and allies to avoid interference from China. And you got a couple notes in here, but
I was reading. Look, this comes from an anonymous source, but apparently DevGru SEAL Team 6 is, at least reportedly, not surprisingly though, training for missions related to the defense of Taiwan. And that's according to a recent report from Financial Times as well. So, this is a tier 1 unit, a JSOC unit that's actively preparing for potentially war with China in and around Taiwan. And so, again, that's not at all surprising. We've also heard from a number of sources that U.S. Army Special Forces, probably from First Group, have ODAs, Special Forces teams in and around Taiwan as well, especially in Kinmen. And so, that's one thing. It's obvious that special operations are in the process of shifting focus to fighting a maritime war in and around Taiwan. Also, CIA Director Bill Burns recently said that 20% of the agency's budget is dedicated to the China mission, 20%. And that's up exponentially from just a few years ago. So it really does seem like the pivot to China is kind of finally catching up. I mean, they've been just kind of babying this for a long time. And, we're here. Also, so Jared, let's look at this. So the CNO, according to the CNO plan, they want to have 80% of all U.S. Navy assets dedicated to the Pacific. Is that correct?
She said 80% of the surface fleet needs to be combat ready by 2027. However, the entirety of the report is focused on the Pacific preparations. Shouldn't link the two directly, but the entire report's about preparing for war with China. So the assumption there is that at least most of these are going to the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then so that is going to leave the Atlantic under-defended. Realistically, I expect some submarine activity in the Atlantic. Of course, I don't know what the Chinese campaign plan is, but just having a couple Russian or Chinese subs in the Atlantic could really cause massive problems for the United States, especially for sea lift, for ship, for troop and equipment transports that may be going to Europe as well. Just put that into context for us, Jared. Like, what's the big concern here?
So the big concern, first off, the federal government is over on the East Coast. That leaves them vulnerable, but also a large number of our imports, even if it may not be a majority, do come through the East Coast. We saw that when the bridge collapsed, like that made a significant impact there. In addition to that, we know that China is preparing for at least some Atlantic operations. Here at Forward Observer, we covered the possibility of a base in the armpit of Africa. There were a few different spots that we were looking at there, and they routinely take their anti-piracy forces around Africa into the Atlantic to go visit European countries and conduct military diplomacy. So they are getting over to the Atlantic and could theoretically send some forces in that direction. It does look like this is kind of a blind spot for the U.S. Navy, that it would potentially leave us open to having our imports disrupted there.
Mm-hmm. As a reminder, too, speaking of imports, 20% of all, just speaking in big round numbers, about 20% of all U.S. imports come from China. So I'll just assume that gets cut down practically to zero. 40% of all U.S. imports come from the broader Indo-Pacific region. One thing we saw with international shipping in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is insurance rates for these carriers went up dramatically. So that alone, if you can even find a maritime insurance company to cover your cargo ship in the Indo-Pacific, things are going to become much more expensive. So altogether, that's 40% of all U.S. imports come from that region, and then another 20% of U.S. imports come from Europe, and so we're looking at potentially severe trade restrictions or severe disruption, potentially up to at least 60% of all U.S. imports. That's going to mean product shortages for us. It's going to mean much higher prices for whatever is available. And by the way, this is not just going to be a short-term problem. This is going to be for years to come. And this is also not to mention how long it is going to take to rebuild those supply lines if the U.S. Navy will even be in a place to secure those shipping lanes. I mean, we can't even stop these missiles coming from the Houthis in Yemen. And now we're talking about potentially piracy all around the world that we have to deal with. And just predation of U.S. Predation of commercial trade, which we have not had to deal with in any substantial amount for a century. I don't know how long. But all this is very concerning. Jared?
I think you kind of touched on a very important point that's a second order effect here. If the U.S. Navy is tied up in a war with China, particularly if 80% of its forces are committed to this, there's no one protecting the global commons there. So piracy, maybe not even state-sponsored piracy, is going to be a bigger concern at major choke points. So we're seeing it at the Red Sea, but Straits of Malacca are enormous for that. The Strait of Hormuz, I don't think would necessarily hit non-state piracy, but we may see an increased bit of piracy from Iran, or if the Houthis can get up there as well. But there are major choke points to be concerned about that you can punch way outside of your weight class as a piracy group there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And also some of it's going to affect the United States. A lot of this is also going to affect China. China is still, the U.S. plan has to be to try to attempt to starve China from imports, especially oil imports. They're extremely reliant on importing all sorts of stuff. All right, so that is the latest. Put 2027 on your calendars. If we get there, we've got our own domestic issues to deal with before then, especially over the next less than 2 months now. So, all right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to Robert. We'll start off inside the Beltway here. Speaking of China, Republicans in the Senate they've introduced this thing called the Strategic Act. And this is something that they're looking at maybe trying to pass next year. What is this act, and what do Republicans want to do?
Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Mike. So this is this act, the Strategic Act, would basically do a few things against China. One, it would strengthen enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, establish what's called a Global Infrastructure Investment Fund. The idea behind this is to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative by giving economic incentives to foreign countries. But I think most importantly, it would direct the Department of Commerce to help U.S. companies, what they say, diversify supply chains away from China and move manufacturing out of China. And this is, I think, the most important part, because U.S. lawmakers and officials have been sounding the alarm for the last year plus about this potential crisis or conflict with China by 2027. And as we've mentioned multiple times, U.S. supply chains are very vulnerable to these geopolitical events. And while this bill does do something important, it intends to try to secure these U.S. supply chains away from China, away from this disruption. I think there's a chance that this also signals to China that we are also preparing for a conflict and would ratchet up tensions. But something else that I think is very important about this is that this National Defense Strategy Bipartisan Commission has pointed out, including in a hearing yesterday, that the U.S. is just ill prepared for a conflict with China. They're saying that within 1,000 miles of China's shore, they basically have military dominance. And I think the bottom line up front here is that the window for deterring this conflict or crisis in the Indo-Pacific is closing due to both this Chinese military advantage in the region and Chinese cyber threat to U.S. critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all good points. This should be a big, between the CNO thing and the Strategic Act. I mean, even just the proposal. This should be a big flashing red light to all multinational corporations, especially in the West, doing business in China. There's already problems with capital controls, not being able to get your money out of China. Maybe at some point. I look at Apple, and I think it was early this year or maybe last year, Apple said, well, we're going to move some production to India. And they've moved it to like a Vietnam or Philippines or something like that. Some of that manufacturing that was happening in China. And we've seen a huge decrease in foreign direct investments into China as well. It does seem like U.S. companies are seeing the picture very clearly, but it doesn't seem like we've seen this drastic response of, really U.S. companies, they need to get the heck out of China. And they maybe have, 2 to 3 years to do that. And by the way, U.S. officials keep saying this is not inevitable. Like war with China is not imminent. War with China is not inevitable. But man, they've been banging this drum on 2027 for such a long time that, it's just something that we have to be actively preparing for, just because it's everything's on the line. By the way, I was out last week, and one of the things I did was read this book called The Mandibles, and it's about a financial crisis, a family. It's a fiction book. But it does have some elements of reality, because they talk about the logical consequences of the fiscal and monetary problems the United States has now. And that book was interesting just because it talked about the day-to-day life in a very realistic way. People losing their jobs, and then food would be delivered to grocery stores in spurts. So people would get there and be elbowing each other, and people just were trying to spend their money like on payday. They would go to the grocery store and they would buy whatever they needed, because if they waited a week, A, the grocery store might be out of stuff, but B, their dollars would not go as far. And I remember being in Argentina. I woke up in my hotel room one morning. I looked out the window and I saw this long line out of bank, and I thought, oh great, there's like another bank run, like stuff's about to go crazy again. And you know what it was? It was payday, and people were going to the bank to take all their money out of the bank and to go and spend it, because inflation and hyperinflation is just a very, very big problem. If we do go to war with China, I fully expect just worse inflation than the 1970s. Something to think about and prepare for as well. All right, let's move on here to the Beltway roll-up. We're going to start off with John Kerry. He can't really can't get out of the news cycle fast enough for me. But John Kerry is talking about accelerating this energy transition to green energy. It's a pipe dream. They're going to try it anyway. What's John Kerry doing?
Yeah, so this was an interesting statement from him. He said because carbon capture technology, he said all the experts say right now they do not believe carbon capture technology is scalable or affordable. And he said if these fossil fuel companies can't actually implement this, we're going to have a bigger and faster transition than people think. And the carbon capture technology thing is important because this is a key part of the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0. Basically, the rule that's driving these coal power plants and potentially liquid natural gas power plants out of business is this requirement that they capture 90% of their carbon emissions. And they've been saying in these hearings for the last year on this Clean Power Plan 2.0 that it's not scalable, it's not viable at scale. So I think these green energy advocates now putting out this message that they agree that it's not viable is an indicator that they're going to put hit the gas on this in this transition from fossil fuel energy, despite everybody in utilities, state regulators, federal regulators saying this is going to have a major negative impact on energy security.
Mm-hmm. Well, energy, let's go ahead and rope in energy security, because the East Coast imports most of its refined petroleum products. So your gasoline on the East Coast probably comes from a foreign refinery. That's another big deal. If we can't get tankers out of India, out of these Indian refineries to the East Coast, I mean, it's another big area for concern. Just talking about energy security in a war with China as well. Good thing our strategic petroleum reserve is filled up all the way, right, Robert?
Yeah, and there was also the point of the Keystone XL pipeline was to move petroleum to U.S. refineries directly. And instead, what we basically, with the Biden administration canceling that pipeline, maintained a system where these petroleum products are exported and then refined and re-imported. So we did have a chance to kind of preempt this. And I think the Trump administration, or the potential future Trump administration, has talked about re-implementing something like the Keystone XL pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Well, something has to be done. All right, let's move on here. More good news. Speaking of Iran and some other stuff going on here. So there was a special envoy named Robert Malley, and it turns out he was on the Iranian payroll. Just before we get into this, can you just remind us exactly what Robert Malley's connection to Iran is?
He was part of what's called the Iran Experts Group, and it was all not only government employees, but it was also a think tank that it was connected to universities. And the idea was they were going to push policies that were favorable to Iran, and that also includes Ariana Tabatabai, who is, as far as I know, still the deputy, or the chief of staff to the deputy secretary of defense for special operations, low intensity conflict.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Robert Malley, he's got a security clearance, a federal security clearance, and they discovered he's got these links to Iran, and apparently an IG investigation said this whole thing was handled improperly. Imagine that. But what else do they say?
Yeah, in this report released yesterday, they released the report, and they also did a closed door briefing for congressional aides, and the IG found that actually the State Department suspended Robert Malley's security clearance in April, but it wasn't actually, the news didn't break until June, when I think he was actually walked out of the State Department. And they said that he continued working and having access to classified information after his clearance was suspended. And interestingly, this was only found out because he was supposed to meet with some senators for a classified briefing on Iran and didn't show, and they started asking questions, and it turned out that the State Department told lawmakers he was on an extended absence of leave without telling them that his security clearance was suspended pending an investigation. And during this briefing, some congressional aides said that the State Department IG said that the State Department purposefully worked to shield Malley from embarrassment and mislead these lawmakers about his clearance suspension, which is something that I thought when we originally reported on it last year was that it seemed really suspicious that nobody was talking about it, other than Congress members asking questions, and it appears they tried to basically cover up his connections to the Iran Experts Group and this whole situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's break this down. So this guy had a security clearance suspended, but he continued having access to classified information. I was never at the State Department. I don't know exactly how it works, but I know how it works in the military and in the civilian intelligence world. You access classified information in a SCIF, and which is a room that's behind a big vault door, and unless it's like an open SCIF, but there's a certain area of a building or certain building, which it's the secure compartmented information facility. So basically that's where all the classified information is kept. That's where all the classified computer systems are kept, like SIPR and JWICS and NSA-NET and all the rest. And so you only get into this facility while it's running if you have a badge. You've got to scan your badge in somewhere. So it's pretty easy. You have what's called an FSO, facility security officer, and part of their job that in the military, like the S2, which is the intelligence and security office, part of their job is to make sure that people with clearance have badges and they can get in and out, and people that don't have clearance don't have badges. So it's amazing to me that this guy's security clearance was suspended, and was his badge taken away? Was he allowed to continue to scan in and go in, or was someone taking classified information out of the SCIF and allowing him access to it? I don't know. There's a lot of, we're talking about big security violations of federal law that would send other people to prison for lifetimes. And I don't know. I guess no one's going to prison over this. Let's move on here to the Teamsters. They said that they were not going to endorse a presidential candidate this year. Robert, why is that significant?
Well, it's significant because they did a couple of polls of the Teamsters members. In a straw poll earlier this year, saw a slight majority for Biden. However, they did an independent electronic and phone poll of Teamsters members in the last 20 days, and found that almost 60% actually supported endorsing Trump. And I think obviously a major union that in the past, for most of the past presidential elections, has supported the Democratic candidate, they can't openly endorse Trump, even though Sean O'Brien has kind of flirted with both parties. And I think part of this is they're concerned about breaking away from the other union leaderships like UAW, who have openly endorsed Harris after Biden dropped out. And I think part of the issue of why they can't openly endorse Trump is that they're worried about getting basically shut out by other shops, because there's a lot of interaction between Teamsters members and other unions like the UAW. They deliver parts and stuff to auto manufacturers, and they're worried about getting shut out of interactions with some of these other unions. And another important part about a lot of these unions, they don't actually have, like the UAW, not every member of UAW, I think actually more than half of UAW members don't actually work in the automotive industry. So they work in tech or the service industry, and I think it's the same for the Teamsters. There's a lot of their members who don't work or aren't truck drivers, and I think that they're worried about losing those members, who some of those shops in like New York and a couple of other states, I think including California, have come out since this announcement and endorsed Harris. And I think unions are worried about supporting Trump over losing those dues paying members. And at least in the UAW's case, it's more than half of their membership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to be an internal split there. Speaking of internal splits, let's move on to some states where union membership is also very important. We're specifically looking at Michigan and Wisconsin. And so we have some judges ruling now that RFK Jr. is going to be taken off the ballot I believe in Wisconsin. That's pending a court case right now.
Correct.
Okay. And then this judge Judge Denise Page in Michigan ruled that RFK Jr. is going to stay on the presidential ballot in Michigan. Robert, how big a deal is this?
Well, I think this is important because RFK Jr. could siphon votes away from Trump in some of these key swing states, and I think that's not the stated rationale necessarily, but I think that is the intent behind basically refusing to remove him from the ballot in Michigan, is that this is a key swing state, and RFK Jr. could siphon even if he siphoned away 2% of votes, that's a big deal for Trump because of the close margins in these swing states. And then, like you said, in Wisconsin, there's still a court case pending with their Court of Appeals. And then I think in North Carolina is the only state so far that has removed RFK Jr. from the ballot.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's important to note. North Carolina. Two things, Robert. This judge in Michigan said she's not going to remove RFK Jr. from the ballot because it would be too disruptive, even though this is something that North Carolina has done. What is the response going to be if RFK gets 0.5% or 1% in Michigan and Harris ends up winning Michigan by 0.5% or 1%? I mean, this does not seem very, very democratic to me. Have someone on the ballot who's not running, especially when you have the opportunity to remove him. This really does seem like politics, but could this, I don't know, all right. I mean, is this going to be a point of contention for the election? Like, is this where the election goes sideways maybe?
Well, I think this is definitely going to be one of those areas where we see a legal fight happening. Obviously, between November and January, they only had, you only have about a month, a little bit more than a month for to seat the new Congress, and then the inauguration, the ballot certification on January 6, 2025. But I think that legal fight could go past that. But it is, I think, going to be one of those areas where we start to see that Democracy Defenders PAC, that is the Democrats, or the former Obama campaign manager, has stood up for some of these legal fights. We're going to start seeing a lot of lawsuits here, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that's another good point. We're not going to know the winner of the presidential election the day after. Could be weeks. All right, let's move on. Just briefly, Robert, another thing you've been talking about on this show frequently, is how power prices are going to go up. In addition to power shortages we think that are going to start next year, I think virtually everyone's going to be paying higher power prices. Just briefly take us through this latest data point.
Yeah, this was a report from a management consultant firm. They're called ICF, and they said that through surveys of utilities and regulators, that electricity demand is expected to grow 9% by 2028. And this is important because this is going to increase the wholesale electricity price by 19% in the same period. And they actually said that they pointed out something that we've been talking about, where the Mid-Atlantic is one of those areas where we're going to see the most demand increase. And they said 68% increase in demand in the Mid-Atlantic. And this is important because the jump in the wholesale price of electricity over the next 4 years is going to have a significant impact on average Americans, much more than would industry. Because, looking through data at the Energy Information Administration, from what I found, industrial customers, their rates tend to be closer to this wholesale price, and residential customers, like average Americans, tend to pay a much higher markup. And the slow pace that we've talked about of these green energy generation projects, where they're running into regulatory hurdles, construction projects are being canceled, and combined with these fossil fuel retirements, especially in the Mid-Atlantic. I think Baltimore has the last fossil fuel power plant in Maryland, and they're setting up to close soon as well. And it's going to really increase the difficulty of meeting the surging power demand.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I did look into this. I did a deep dive a few months ago, and that's what really, looking at the numbers, really is what led me to believe, yes, there is going to be power shortage problems in the United States, not in every region, but in a handful of regions. So in the Mid-Atlantic, you have demand increasing by 68% over the next 4 years. That's probably largely driven by these AI data centers. Again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can tell you reserve margin for power production in the Mid-Atlantic is not 68%. It's nowhere near 68%. It will not be 68% in the next 4 years. So it does seem like the Mid-Atlantic is kind of ground zero here for power shortages when during these, and I'm not just talking about the summer heat waves where demand exceeds supply and you get these brownouts. I'm talking about like middle of September, there's not enough electrical production to meet demand, and I guess people are going to have to deal with scheduled outages, or maybe I don't know how they're going to do it, but it's going to be a problem. Robert, thanks for staying on top of that. And I'll tell you, I don't want to overdose anyone on black pills today, but let's go ahead and get into this Bank of America's Global Fund Manager Survey. Bank of America, every month, they survey about 300 asset managers from around the world. So everything from like retirement and pension account management to hedge funds to bankers and so on. And in this latest survey, they found that 79% of investment managers surveyed expect a soft landing. So a soft landing is where economic growth slows down, but we do not have a recession. Just 11% now expect a hard landing, which would be a recession, and 7% expect a no landing scenario with strong economic growth. Over half of these respondents said that they do not expect a recession within the next 18 months. And that is also kind of the official narrative we are getting from most media outlets. 36%, however, said they do expect a recession in 2025. Now, a couple of things here. I read all these global fund manager surveys, but I do take them with a grain of salt because they're really a snapshot in time. However, I do think they're a good picture of current sentiment. Compared to a year ago, these numbers have actually improved. The soft landing view has increased from 64% to 79%. That's an important trend. Hard landing proponents have decreased from 21% down to 11%. But there are some important indicators that do not give me a lot of optimism. Historically, you just look at, I think it's the past 60 or 100 years or something. Well, yes, at least 60 years. Historically, 71% of these Fed rate hiking cycles end in recession. It means 29% don't. So just historically, the odds are stacked against the Fed. However, this 50 basis point cut, so this 0.5% cut that the Fed introduced yesterday to the federal funds rate, has happened in only 4 periods out of the past 35 years. So that's 1991 to 1992, 2001 to 2002, 2007 to 2008, and 2020. All of those were recession years. So regardless of whether we have a recession, just looking at some historical indicators, I would bet on a recession next year. You know, and also we can talk about the fuzzy math behind what actually constitutes a recession. Some people, like I look at Jeff Gundlach, he says we're already in a recession. By the way, he's a billionaire. He's a big bond manager. He's founder of Double Line Capital. He says we're already in a recession, and the official numbers are just not reflecting that. So I also acknowledge that. Let's move on, Jared, to the global roll-up here. Let's also talk about Israel, because in addition to the past couple of days worth of excitement in Lebanon as these pagers and radios are blowing up, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is also talking about a quote-unquote new phase of this war on Gaza. Apparently they're pivoting north now.
Yes, he didn't elaborate too much on that, just that there would be a new phase. However, at the same time, the Israeli Defense Force announced that it would redeploy the 98th Division to northern Israel away from southern Israel immediately. So I'm sure, being Army, you can explain a lot more of what a division is, like, and how significant that is. I noticed it was higher than a brigade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would expect that to be somewhere around 10,000 troops. I'm not exactly sure how the Israeli military is constituted. I've never looked into it, but we can look into that.
Okay. Yeah, being Navy, I have a very different concept of a division. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's about it. It looks like your assessment yesterday that they are potentially preparing for action in Lebanon does that. I think these are two very strong indicators that is about to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm just looking this up. The 98th Division, if this is the same one, it's actually an airborne paratroopers division here. We can look up the numbers later.
Okay.
All right, let's move on here to next item. Over in Ukraine, the foreign ministry is asking Romania to shoot Russian drones out of the sky in Ukrainian airspace. This seems like an area that NATO would be now officially involved in this conflict. What's going on?
Yes, this is the latest NATO member to be asked for this. Poland was asked recently, and one of the Baltic states was considering doing that in Russian territory, but hadn't actually confirmed. The big thing here is that Ukraine's foreign minister is asking them to do this over Ukrainian airspace immediately after Romania donated a Patriot missile system. And yes, this would be direct NATO involvement. From what I've seen, though, no NATO member has confirmed that they will shoot outside of their own airspace, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't expect this to happen, but it would be very significant if they did. Also, the Justice Department is announcing the FBI has disrupted another Chinese cyber actor, another what they're calling a botnet system. It's affecting 200,000 routers. What's going on?
Yes, this whole series of consumer devices. There were small office and home office routers, IP cameras, digital video recorders, and network attached storage devices. So just a very broad range here. And the botnet system was actually developed by a Chinese company that sells the ability to hack into and control thousands of consumer devices worldwide. We were talking before the show about how this is they're calling this Flax Typhoon, the American forces are. This is different from the Volt Typhoon that we've talked about in the past, in that this is actually a seizure of control over devices as opposed to reconnaissance.
All right, interesting. This is another reason to expect a crisis or conflict with China is going to involve cyber attacks. It's going to disrupt our information communications environment. By the way, this is why we started the Early Warning Ham Radio Network. Now it's the Early Warning Amateur Radio Network, or EWARN for short, because we still want the ability to send out intelligence. Even if the internet goes down, we're still going to have the ability to send and receive information. And those nets, the official EWARN net is continuing to happen on Friday night. However, now we have this partnership with Amron, and so they're going to be doing rolling nets coast to coast by time zone. And so if you would like more information or learn how you can get involved, go over to the Ham Radio Hub over on the Early Warning Network app, either on a mobile device or on the web. I use the web version, and you can get information and learn about how you can receive official reporting from the Early Warning Network via ham radio. Also, tonight, I believe it's at 7. Tonight on the Early Warning Network app, we're also doing I'll spend about an hour or maybe 2 with Early Warning Network members for the Area Study Challenge, where I'm going to be talking about how to build an area study, what kinds of information that you should put in your area study, specifically focusing on the election. So there's a template, and it's a general template, but tonight we're really going to be looking at what do we need to know about our area in case we do have a sideways election, a contested election, a failed election, whatever's going to happen. So we're really going to be focusing on the political and social landscape tonight. That's tonight at 7 p.m. Go ahead. If you go to the events tab, you can just hit the RSVP button. You'll get an alert when this thing kicks off tonight at 7 p.m. Now,